Good morning. Welcome to Ripon Community Church. My name is Sam. I'm one of the pastors here. It is so good to be here with all of you. I want to tell you a little story. About a year ago, my wife and I, we had one of those like overnight things, where you leave your kids somewhere else. You know what those are? Those are wonderful things. About a year ago, we had one of those, and we were headed down to Madison. And as we went down to Madison, we were going to go to this restaurant. We were excited, right? Like it had been a little while since we had been able to go to a nice restaurant like this. This particular restaurant was one that we had been to before, and it was so delicious. It was so incredible. The service was great. The atmosphere was great. All of those things were really incredible. And so we were just so excited to go have this night away and go to this restaurant. And I remember as we got there and we start showing up at the restaurant, we walk in and they'd just done a big old renovation, and you walk in and it looks nice, right? Like it was fine, similar to what it was before. And you walk in and you get seated, and the waitress comes up to serve us, and I'm sure she's such a nice person, but like, it was just not her night. If you ever had those experiences, it was just not her night. The service just wasn't very great. It was kind of cold, a little weird, very awkward, like, do you want food or not sort of thing. And so we were sitting there like, okay, it's fine. The food last time we were here was incredible, so I'm sure it'll be great. And so we decided we're going to kind of push through and have a good night with some good food. We're going to start with a charcuterie board, because who doesn't like sharing a bunch of great, fun things together? And I've never in my life liked olives, but recently I've learned that there's these ones that are super salty and big and great, and like, oh, we'll have some of those. So I'm like, we'll have some olives on this charcuterie board, and they show up right down in front of us, and the olives is like this bowl, and there's like 30 of them. Who eats 30 olives? Nobody eats 30 olives. And when I grabbed one to eat it, it was like gnawing skin off a large rock. Like they had to have 30 olives because there was nothing on them. It was disgusting. And so that was one of those moments, right, where reality does not meet expectations. Have you ever experienced that before in your life? So what's interesting about this is they went through this whole renovation to make the place better, but as they were doing that, they missed the part that mattered the most. The service, the food, like these are the essential ingredients. Today, we are in week 3 of Build It Well, our summer study of the book of Nehemiah. And when you're building something well, the outside matters, it does. But if what's on the inside isn't worth defending, the walls were never worth building in the first place, and God certainly won't be blessing it anytime soon. Now, before we can really catch the significance of chapter 5, which we're going to be talking about today, we first have to establish a truth. Are you ready for it? Nod your heads. You're with me still? Good. Okay. This is the truth we have to establish. Have you ever heard someone say something to the effect of, I really love the God of Jesus, right? Like, Jesus is great. I'm down with Jesus. I like Jesus. I like following Jesus. But that whole Old Testament God, I'm not so sure. Like, have any of you heard that phrase before? Raise your hands. Yes, you've heard someone talk about that before. Like the Old Testament versus the New Testament Jesus, hard to really get behind. Underneath this comment is this idea that the God of the Old Testament before Jesus is somehow different from the God of the New Testament after Jesus. And I get where this comes from. It's totally understandable, because there's some stuff in the Old Testament that, without the cultural context that's required, can knock you off your chair. It can be so jarring. But here's what you need to know. It's not true. It's hogwash, baloney, nonsense. It's not true. God is the same God. Old Testament, New Testament, before Jesus arrived, after Jesus rose, now and forever, God's character does not change. The only truth in that statement is that our way of interacting with God and being made right with God has changed. Jesus changed that with the cross and the empty grave. But God didn't change. Here's why that matters. It matters for us, especially today, because if you want to know the pathway to experiencing a life that is blessed by God, it requires something of you. It requires that you live according to God's character. Nehemiah, he gets this, he understands this, and you'll see that in just a minute. But first, we really need to grasp God's character just a little bit more. And in order to do that, I need us to talk about something. I want you to drum roll, right? Can you guys do a drum roll for me this morning? You've never done this in church before, have you? Drum roll. We need to talk about we worked all week long on that sound effect. Leviticus. Have you ever heard, fireworks in Leviticus in one situation ever before? No, you haven't, because that's not normally the kind of thing that you expect to accompany the book of Leviticus. And if you're not familiar with the Bible, Leviticus is a difficult book to read. Leviticus is a book of laws, a book of rules, a book of weird things that take some work to understand sometimes. Leviticus, the thought of reading that book in the Bible is kind of like reading the back of the nutrition facts on the back of a box of cereal. It's like reading the terms and conditions and the privacy policy that you have to agree to before you can open your phone. How many actually read that? Nobody. So far, 2 services, nobody actually reads it. I don't either. It's like reading the meeting notes where people talk like this. It's the textbook from your least favorite class in high school. That's what it is. That's what it emerges from us when you think, I have to read Leviticus. That's Leviticus. You get my point. It's like all of those things, unless. It's feeling like torture unless you know why it was written. Once you know why it was written, it can actually become fascinating. Maybe not a page turner, but at the very least, incredibly interesting. Here's why. Leviticus was the set of rules God uses for 2 purposes. The first purpose is this. It was to help the Israelite nation show the world God's character. These were the laws that were designed to help them show the world what God was like. Secondly, another set of those laws were to ensure that this nation of his, this nation of God's set-apart people, the one that he had brought out of Egypt to stay special, stay set apart, different and unique, so that they could continue to be the ones to show off his character. These laws were designed to keep them unique. For example, take a look at this. It's from chapter 25 of Leviticus. It says this: if one of your fellow Israelites falls into poverty and cannot support himself, support him as you would a foreigner or a temporary resident, and allow him to live with you. Do not charge interest or make a profit at his expense. Instead, show your fear of God by letting him live with you as your relative. A little later, it says this in chapter 25. It says, if one of your fellow Israelites falls into poverty and is forced to sell himself to you, do not treat him as a slave. Treat him instead as a hired worker or as a temporary resident who lives with you, and he will serve you only until the year of Jubilee. Year of Jubilee was a special thing where everything's supposed to go back to how it was, and it's a really big celebration year, crazy stuff. You should read about it. It's really cool. But anyways, keep going. At that time, he and his children will no longer be obligated to you, and they will return to their clans and go back to the land originally allotted to their ancestors. The people of Israel are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt, so they must never be sold as slaves. Show your fear of God by not treating them harshly. Show your fear of God by not treating them harshly. Show your fear of God and take care of them. Show your fear of God and treat them with dignity. Show your fear of God by reflecting God's character. This is what he's calling them to do. Now, they never do it, like they never live up to the law like it should, and that shows us our need so much for God's grace. But in these verses, God lays out a set of laws designed to help keep his people free, keep them out of slavery. This is the character of God in law form. Israel was to be a nation that would show people the character of God that required them to live a certain way in order for them to actually show it. The Bible, it has this way of surprising us, doesn't it? Like this was written thousands of years ago, and we still have so much to learn from it. Now, with Leviticus chapter 25 kind of notched in your brain, let's take a look at how chapter 5 of Nehemiah starts. They've been building the wall, and then this happens. It says this: about this time, some of the men and their wives raised a cry of protest against their fellow Jews. They were saying, "We have such large families. We need more food to survive." Others said, "We have mortgaged our fields, vineyards, and homes to get food during the famine." And others said, "We have had to borrow money on our fields and vineyards to pay our taxes. We belong to the same family as those who are wealthy, and our children are just like theirs. Yet we must sell our children into slavery just to get enough money to live. We have already sold some of our daughters, and we are helpless to do anything about it, for our fields and vineyards are already mortgaged to others." See the parallel? Leviticus 25. Right here in Nehemiah, they're talking about the same things. Here we are, and here they are, working their tails off to build the walls around the city, a wall that's to protect their holy city, a holy city that's supposed to house a set-apart people that are called to show the world God's character, ultimately through Jesus. And people are being sold into slavery. People are starving. I love the next line because it's biblical and it's justified. Nehemiah, it says this: "When I heard their complaints, I was very angry." And wouldn't you be too? Like, that's not right. It's not how things should be. They were building the walls to protect the city. Protecting the city was pointless if they didn't actually represent God's character while doing it. Here's the principle for building something well and living a life that God blesses. Like a restaurant that makes the outside look great, but forgets that it's about the food and the service. Those are the things that matter the most. When you're attempting to build something well, you cannot neglect what's on the inside. If you're building an organization, it's the way you treat your employees, it's the way you treat your customers. It matters. In your family, it's how you treat your kids, how you treat your family. That matters. You can build something shiny, but it's pointless if what's at the heart of it is rotten. And remember how God's character hasn't changed? Remember how it's always been the same? Let me share with you how I know that this is true. Sometimes when you talk about Jesus, people would say, "Oh, Jesus is kind of like a softie. You know, like he's so compassionate, so loving," and we give him this air of being the type of pushover that he isn't. He's not a pushover. And I know this because there are certain situations where Jesus is just scathing, right? Like he talks fairly harshly with some people. He does not mince words, especially when he's talking about the religious leaders of the day. Take a look at this. This is what he says. This is from Jesus. He says, "The teachers of religious law and the Pharisees are the official interpreters of the law of Moses. So practice and obey whatever they tell you. But don't follow their example, for they don't practice what they teach. They crush people with unbearable religious demands and never lift a finger to ease the burden." Just a few verses later, he says this about them. It says, "What sorrow awaits you, teachers of religious law, and you Pharisees, hypocrites! For you cross land and sea to make one convert, and then you turn that person into twice the child of hell you yourselves are." Whew! That's Jesus. That's intense. And he says this: "What sorrow awaits you, teachers of religious law, and you Pharisees, hypocrites! For you're like whitewashed tombs, beautiful on the outside, but filled on the inside with dead people's bones and all sorts of impurity. Outwardly you look like righteous people, but inwardly your hearts are filled with hypocrisy and lawlessness." That's not a softie. That's not a pushover. That's Jesus. Talking about whitewashed tombs, beautiful things on the outside, filled with dead bones on the inside. It's brutal. Jesus isn't mincing his words. He's fiercely blunt. Why? Why is he fiercely blunt? He's so brutally harsh because they're doing the very thing that's most damaging. They're misrepresenting the character of God. If there's anything that frustrates God, it's a facade. It's pretending on the outside to cover up something ugly on the inside. Better to just be ugly through and through. At least you're honest in that moment. Our church has a mission, and the mission is to represent Jesus well. And one of the pillars of that call from God is that you can't pretend. You can't fake it. I mean, you could pretend for a while, but in the end, what's on the inside will ultimately rise to the surface. And this is why it's so important to have that transformation happen at the core level. Nehemiah, he understood this. The picture of beautiful walls protecting a city doesn't really do much for you when inside the city there's just rotten people. It's just another whitewashed tomb. When you are building something well, you cannot neglect what's on the inside. A couple weeks ago, a team from RCC went to Honduras on a short-term mission trip, and this is the team. And I love this picture because it's such a good picture of our church. There's people from all ages. There's people that have been a Christian for a really long time. There's people that are new to their faith. Additionally, they're all coming with different sets of skill sets that are amazing how they work to help each other out. It's just an incredible team. And so they went down on this trip a couple weeks ago, and where they went, this organization they went with is called Mission Lazarus. It's in Honduras, and it's super top-notch. My wife Meg and I, we led a trip like 10 years ago to this place and experienced, it was just incredible. And what this organization does so well is make sure that we're not going in as the heroes. We get to share labor and funding to make an impact on people's lives, but the entire organization is run by Hondurans on the ground, and when we're down there, we work side by side with them the whole time. And as much as this team gave, I can assure you, I can promise you that they feel like they received something far more valuable. It's a picture of how God works in this worldwide kingdom that he created. Now, I know that when they were down there, because I've chatted with a number of them, that there was this one particular day that they experienced something really difficult. It was just an incredibly stretching day. And as they were down there, they did something pretty remarkable. They did something really neat together, and I think they were changed because of it. And they told that story, if you want to take a look.
The route to get there was through the jungle, farther back than we had ever gone before.
We couldn't get the truck close. A half-mile hike through cow trails on the side of a steep mountain.
The guy got out and pulled out a machete. You know you're in trouble when the guy pulls out a machete, that you need to get there.
There were rocks, there were tree trunks that were in the way, and it was just, to me, perilous.
Every one of us had doubts, all of us. Seeing how far it was, the location, how far we were going to have to carry this very heavy concrete slab.
Could we do it or couldn't we do it? What should we do? How do we do it?
And in that moment, I was thinking, we cannot leave this behind. God would not have got us to this point, to these people's house, if we couldn't do it.
At that moment, we stopped as a group and we said, this is a decision that needs to be made. It's going to be a little bit dangerous.
Together decided these people need this latrine, so let's do it. And by the grace and the power and the strength of God, he showed us how to do it.
So from there, 6 or 7 of us grabbed the concrete slab, and while we were carrying it, we had to take breaks all the time, and we prayed.
They were physically weak, and they needed to get their strength from God.
Through God's strength and good communication, we got it there, slowly but surely.
Us women, we took all the latrine parts, we put them on our heads, and we hiked all the way up to their house.
I know that we ran into obstacles there because there was no real clear path into the home. There was a rock wall that I can't remember who suggested, let's just lift the panel pieces over and continue on from there.
And so we lifted them over the wall, and by the time we got them over the wall, we were ready to start the latrine.
And we ended up finishing the latrine that day. And I think it really proved how much trust we had in the Lord and how he brought us all together with so much strength and courage.
How we all had to rely on each other and all rely on the Lord.
That family expressed to us their thankfulness because back where they lived, back deep in the jungle of southern Honduras, nobody came to them. They felt like nobody cared about them.
It was such an awesome feeling when we did and we accomplished what God sent us to do.
So when they got back, there was this sense from each person that I spoke with that they'd changed, that they'd grown in appreciation of everything that they had. They wanted to live for something more. Here's the second principle today for how to live a life that God blesses. It's very simple. It's hard. It's listen. Don't lose sight of who you're building for. Put yourself in a position where you're willing to hear and see what people are dealing with, what they're struggling with. That's one of the reasons that these short-term mission trips are so valuable. If it was just about the project, it would be more beneficial and cost-effective to just send money. It's not just about the project. It's about the relationship. It's about seeing people that are often hidden from your view, helping them, but more importantly, experiencing a relationship with them, seeing their joy when they likely have so much less materially, but then also seeing that they often have far more than we do spiritually. That's a gift you can't pay for. Now, Nehemiah was willing to listen. But what happened next? This is the easiest part to miss. It's 4 simple words. See if you can catch them. It says this. It says, after thinking it over, I spoke out against these nobles and officials. I told them, you are hurting your own relatives by charging interest when they borrow money. Then I called a public meeting to deal with the problem. Did you notice the 4 words? After thinking it over. The next step is this. It's filter what you've heard through God's character. It's not reactionary, it's thoughtful. It's on purpose. It's referencing what you're dealing with and what you're hearing through if what God's character says is the right thing. When you're building something, people will need to sacrifice. There are seasons when, because the cause and the mission is so great, the collective group of people will need to make sacrifices that are large. But there is a line. There is a line, and often it's a bit gray, where the sacrifice is disproportionately laid on certain people, and it's just not right. When this is the case, and it's obviously opposed to God's character, that's when it's time to act. So you start with not neglecting what's on the inside. You listen. You don't lose sight of who you're building for. And then 3, you filter what you've heard through God's character. After thinking it over, Nehemiah, he concluded that this was very obviously not square with what God's character is. So he calls the meeting of the people involved, and he does the 4th thing on our list today. Number 4 is this. It's keep your values intact. Keep what you're doing in line with what God's character is. It says this next, Nehemiah 5, 9 through 12. It says, then I press further. What are you doing? What you are doing is not right. Should you not walk in the fear of our God in order to avoid being mocked by enemy nations? This is echoing Leviticus, right? I myself, as well as my brothers and my workers, have been lending the people money and grain, but now let us stop this business of charging interest. Continues, it says, you must restore their fields, vineyards, olive groves, and homes to them this very day and repay the interest you charged when you lent them money, grain, new wine, and olive oil. They replied, we will give back everything and demand nothing more from the people. We will do as you say. Now, it would seem he's kept things intact. He's kept the values intact. It would seem that we should be done at this point. Like, hey, we've got everything ready. We're set to go. Let's move forward. You're remembering who you're building for, you're listening, you're filtering what you've heard through God's character, you're keeping the organizational values intact, keeping it in line with God's character. But there's one more principle here in chapter 5 of Nehemiah, and it's the hardest to hold to. But it's also the most important of them all. So this morning, if you've tuned out so far, like if you've been falling asleep, I get it, it's fine. Wake up for just now, because this is the one point that if you get nothing else from this message this morning, don't miss this one. If you're leading something, family, a business, a team, nonprofit, whatever, you matter. You have to embody it yourself. Nehemiah understood this clearly. It says this: for the entire 12 years that I was governor of Judah, from the 20th year to the 32nd year of the reign of King Artaxerxes, neither I nor my officials drew on our official food allowance. The former governors, in contrast, had laid heavy burdens on the people, demanding a daily ration of food and wine, besides 40 pieces of silver. Even their assistants took advantage of the people, but because I feared God, I did not act that way. I also devoted myself to working on the wall and refused to acquire any land. Here it is. Principle number 5 of the day for building something in a way that God will bless. It's this, number 5, it starts with you. Match what's inside with what people see on the outside. It starts with you. This was Nehemiah's personal prayer. He knew that he had to embody it in order to lead it. And it's not easy. I mean, our character won't grow perfect overnight. We get that, but with steps of following Jesus, doing our best to trust him and to daily represent him the best we can, God does transform us through his power. He does begin to match what's inside of us and align what's inside of us and outside of us with what he wants us to be and who he wants us to be. By living this way, Nehemiah was calling God to follow through on his promises, essentially. He was saying, hey, God, I'm living this way. I know I could be taking a bunch from the people. I could be doing a whole bunch of stuff that I really shouldn't do, but I could be. But I expect, because I'm living your way, that you're going to bless me for it. Look at what he says. He says it straight up from him. He says, remember, oh my God, all that I have done for these people, and bless me for it. It seems kind of bold to say that, doesn't it? That's God. Like, hey, God, bless me. Look what I'm doing. But it's right. Like, he's living God's way. And if you live God's way, you should be blessed. But let me be very clear. I'm not saying that if you live this way, God's going to make you rich. That's not what the blessing is. Necessarily. You might. It might happen. That's great. But that's not the point. I'm saying you'll be blessed because you built God's way, not your own way. You'll be blessed with the things that matter the most in life. Relationships and friendships. A peace that only God can offer. A certain hope that's found in Jesus. And also, whatever you're leading, as you lead it and build it God's way, it will be more sustainable. It will be healthier, more solid. It will likely be more successful, especially over the long haul. As you lead it God's way, keep what's inside healthy. Keep what's inside in line with God's character. Don't fake it. Actually desire God to transform you from the inside. Represent Jesus well with how you lead. 5 things we talked about this morning. You can't neglect what's on the inside. Listen. Filter what you've heard through God's character. Keep your values intact. And most importantly, if you don't get anything else this morning, remember you can criticize everybody else, but what really is valuable is are you doing it yourself? It starts with you. So that's how we're going to finish this morning. I'm going to say a prayer, and I'm going to ask God to help me live as though it starts with me, because it does. And it starts with each of you because it does. and that we could ask God to help us represent Jesus well in the way we live here on a Sunday and also Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, out in Ripon and beyond. That we would be that kind of light and that he'd work through us as we lead in various different ways. If you want that for yourself this morning, would you bow your heads and pray with me now? Dear God, thank you. Thank you that you have always been the same. Yesterday, today, tomorrow, you do not change. Your character, your nature does not change. And that character and nature is filled with love for us, fierce love for us. God, we ask that as we follow you, you would help what's inside of us to line up with what's on the outside. That as a church, that you would continue to form us into a people who are devoted to you and living your way, and that what's on the outside would mirror the goodness on the inside, and that goodness would continue to grow. But most importantly this morning, God, we know that none of that happens unless we take it personally, unless we believe and trust that it starts with us, and that you can lead through us individually. So God, we ask that we would be the type of people who would represent you well, not faking it, but truly being transformed over time by you. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.